Today's lesson is an introduction to evolution. You're going to get kind of a little bit of the background, and then we'll lead into our next lessons on really how do we understand it today. So evolution, the early ideas about it started off with scientists just pondering or questioning, why is the life on Earth so diverse? And how did we get millions and millions of different organisms of different shapes and sizes, occupying all different habitats on Earth? So we talk about, because of all of these differences, we use the term diversity, referring to the variety of living things that inhabit our planet. For this lesson, I'd like you to be able to describe the theory of evolution, not in detail, but just as the organizing principle of life science that explains two things. One, the millions of different species of plants, animals, and microorganisms, and more that live on Earth today are all related by descent from common ancestors, which is the claim of evolution. And two, that the great diversity of organisms is the result of more than 3.8 billion years of evolution since life began. Evolution is an inheritable change in the characteristics of organisms in a population over generations. So that's the definition. Then we have the theory of evolution, or evolutionary theory. And we talk about it so much today, so widely, because of the collection of scientific facts, observations, and hypotheses that have been studied and supported in order to attempt to explain how life on Earth is so diverse. A lot of the information that we know today, because about evolution, is based on the work of Charles Darwin from the 1800s. He was not the only one to come up with the idea of what evolution is. There were some other scientists. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about a couple other scientists, and then we'll look at what Charles Darwin did. One of those other scientists was named Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He was French, and he proposed that organisms inherit changes caused by use or disuse in their parents. So, for example, he considered giraffes. If a parent giraffe were to stretch its neck to get at the leaves on taller trees, then its descendants or its offspring will have that longer neck. His theory has been disproven. We do not have evidence of that happening. Sometimes you might hear that come up in discussions today, but we do not have the evidence to support that. And here's just a little illustration of what Lamarck thought. So he imagined the giraffe as a short-necked ancestor. And then they tried to reach leaves on taller trees, so they had to stretch their neck and stretched some more. And eventually their necks stretched out, and then the future generations of giraffes would be born with longer necks. That is not correct. Do not think that this is what evolution is. This was an incorrect thought. Another person who thought about evolution and the diversity of life was named Alfred Russel Wallace. He was also British, like Charles Darwin, and is considered a co-discoverer of the theory of evolution. And you may hear that even though they both wrote about and thought about evolution, the reason that Darwin is the person that we credit with evolution is because he published his work first. His main question was asking, why do we find this animal in this place, right? So certain animals and organisms you only find in certain habitats. So that's where he started thinking about, why is this animal fit to live here and not maybe somewhere else? So he realized that animals are shaped by where they live, and an area where you find animals can be described by the animals that live there. Back to Darwin. In 1831, he completed college and joined the crew of a ship called the HMS Beagle. Here is a painting of that, for a 5-year trip around the world. This voyage would turn out to be one of the most important trips in the history of science. And you might argue that it's more life science, but it was very, very important. On this trip, Darwin made observations, he collected evidence, and this all led him to propose his theory of evolution about the way life changes over time. Let's get to some of those observations. They included that many of the plants and animals he observed were well suited to the environments in which they were living. For example, some of the adaptations of plants and animals in the desert would not be seen in organisms that live in a rainforest because of the different climate and habitat. The adaptations that he described, they are characteristics of organisms that improve their survival and reproduction in specific environments. Here's a quick example. The adaptations of desert plants are roots, stems, and leaves that help them store water because they don't get water very frequently, versus trees in the tropical rainforest have shallow roots. As you can see, some of them are above ground because most of the nutrients are in the topsoil. So they get their nutrients from very shallow, so near the surface. Something else Darwin observed was variation. Variation is differences in traits among organisms. For example, the variety of beaks in finches, a type of birds in the Galapagos Islands. So as you can see in this picture, there are 4 different beak shapes. Why do you think they have different beaks? They have different beaks because they eat different foods, and they use their beaks to eat. Number 1, this type of finch eats nuts. Number 2, eats seeds, so the beak is better for cracking seeds. The other one eats insects, and this 4th one digs in moss for insects. So its beak is good for digging as well as grabbing the insects. Something else Darwin did was collect many fossils on his voyage. Fossils, as you know, are the preserved remains of ancient organisms, and you can see in one of these pictures here, one of these fossils is organisms that no longer exist, such as the giant sloth. We are familiar with sloths today, but the giant sloth no longer exists. And then he also found organisms that do resemble currently living species. All the evidence from his fossils told us that organisms can go extinct, die out, but also that existing species are likely related to something that lived in the past or an ancient species. Darwin also found fossils of marine organisms in the mountains, so we did have some evidence that geologic change occurred as well, with uplifting of seas and things like that. Darwin noted that organisms found on each island in the Galapagos had special adaptations, and in some cases allowed them to survive only on that island. They were so specially adapted. He also noted the variation, or the similarities and differences among many different organisms. And because of this, Darwin became convinced that organisms had changed over time. And when we gather more evidence, we use that to build up the theory of evolution.